Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And we are about to start the 2044 to 2045 offseason. Fortunately, we are starting the offseason from a position of strength. 109 wins during the regular season gave our Athletics the best record in baseball. And more importantly than that, we ended up securing our third consecutive World Series championship. Took out the Pittsburgh Pirates 4-1 in the World Series. We actually ended up losing exactly one game in each of the playoff series that we played. We took out the Toronto Blue Jays in the Division Series 3 out of 4. Took out the Kansas City Royals in the LCS 4 out of 5. And then, as I mentioned, also won 4 out of 5 games against Pittsburgh on our way to the three-peat this past season. And a quick final review of our team statistics before we move on to our annual review of our roster, who did what, who underperformed, who overperformed, who's certainly back with us next year, who's definitely not going to be back, and who we need to make some difficult decisions on in the coming weeks. Our 109-53 record was just a game above Pythagorean expectations. We had a winning record every month of the season, except technically for the regular season in October when we split our 2 games at the end of the year, but certainly made up for that with our 11-3 record in the playoffs between October right into the start of November. Although I think actually we technically won on Halloween evening, the final game against Pittsburgh, so we didn't actually play in November this year. Incredible offense this year, first in the league in runs allowed, and you can see first in every offensive category. So an absolutely dominant offense, led the league in stolen bases as well, third in base running. Middle of the pack in defensive efficiency, ranking 9th and 10th in zone rating. So our fielding, after being a great strength in many recent years, was somewhat more meh in 2044. The pitching, 4th in the American League in runs allowed, is actually a down year for our Oakland Athletics, but we still led the league in starters, ERA, pitcher WAR, and strikeouts. And we're the top 4 in every pitching category except for BABIP. We were middle of the pack in BABIP with a .295 batting average against our pitchers, and our batting average on balls in play. And that was right in the middle of the American League, ranking 8th overall. And we're going to have to make some very difficult decisions this offseason, because although our owner, 83-year-old John Fisher, the penny pincher, did increase our budget for next year to $200 million, that still ranks only tied for 26th in all of baseball. And unfortunately, as you can see right now, we've got almost $195 million in salary obligations potentially on the books for next year, which would rank us 8th in terms of payer payroll, which would be fantastic if we could actually afford it. Unfortunately, that will not be the case. Even pulling our scouting and development and draft budgets, I guess really our scouting and development budgets, down to bare bones numbers with just an adequate draft budget and an adequate IAFA budget. We're $21+ million in the red at this point. So we need to remove a lot of salary from the organization. The 3 most obvious choices are the players who will be the 3 most expensive for us next year if we brought them all back. Darnell Selvey, Luis Godina, and Chisin Iwata, all set to make between $22 and $26 million in arbitration next year. Federico Arriola, who's chasing a 4th consecutive Cy Young Award, set to be making about $15 million next year. Some other guys where we may have some decisions to make: Macho Rangel, Joe Heilman, and Kevin King, along with the reliever Wilson Rangel, making some pretty good money next year. I think the most logical of them to move on from is probably the reliever Wilson Rangel, although his number is not as high. He just doesn't have the same impact as a reliever, similar to the move we've made with the likes of Jonathan Shearer in recent years. Might just be getting too expensive for a middle reliever / setup man for us. Jesus Aguilar, a utility outfielder, set to make about $2.5 million. Phil Swenson, a utility infielder, set to make $3 million, also could be on the short list of people to move on from. And given that we may have a new person to play center field in young Ben Prince, could also certainly be looking to trade away center fielder Bobby Armstrong this offseason, which would free up another $6 million. So between trades of players who are already signed, perhaps trades of players who are arbitration eligible to get something in return from a team with more financial resources than us, there's definitely a lot of moves that we're going to need to be considering in the coming weeks, because we're certainly going to need to right size our payroll before we get to 2045. And we'll start off the review this year taking a look at our everyday players who put up that incredible offense that led the league in every category. And as you can see, defensively, we've actually got a lot of outstanding defenders, particularly in our infield and our catching positions. A little more range in the outfield, but somewhat surprising that we were a mediocre defensive team this past year with the skill that we do have. Homegrown Luis Covarrubias spent a full season in the majors with us this year as the backup catcher to the great Jonah Richards. Covarrubias hit .241 for us in 203 at-bats. He actually ended up being our starting catcher over the second half of the year against left-handed pitching to save a little wear and tear on Mr. Richards by letting him DH. That got Covarrubias great glove into the lineup a bit more often. Was definitely a below-average offensive player with a 68 WRC plus, but still put up a 1 WAR on the season. Taking a look at the fielding stats, even though he started just 53 games for us behind the plate, his catcher framing saved us almost 6 runs over the course of the year. And you'll see in context that number looks even more impressive because Jonah Richards is a pretty good defensive catcher as well. And in 109 games started, his catcher framing didn't even save us 3 runs, which really shows how fantastic Covarrubias is at framing. But as long as we have Jonah Richards, he's likely to be primarily a backup. Jonah Richards, with the fact that he did start behind the plate less often this year, got some extra games playing at DH when we moved Covarrubias to start against left-handed pitching. The end result was another really good offensive season for Richards, although honestly down a bit from what we've come to expect from him. The .282 batting average with 28 homers and 97 ribbies, very productive for a catcher, but his OPS was just below 900 after being over 1,000 in previous seasons, and a 142 WRC plus is excellent, albeit not as exceptional as the 185 he put up a year ago. Still put up a WAR of close to 6 for us on the season. And Richards, at this point, with 4 full years in the majors behind him, perennial all-star who was the MVP in 2041 or 2042 and the Rookie of the Year in 2041, still has a career batting average of exactly 300 as he will be heading into his age 28 season next year. So with Mr. Covarrubias and with Mr. Richards behind the plate, feeling like that position is very set for years to come. However, we will almost certainly have some turnover in the infield this coming off-season, and one of the key decisions involves infielder Luis Godina. We've been so good defensively that he's typically been a first baseman for us. As we talked about earlier, set to be making well over $20 million next season. Had a vintage Luis Godina season this year, 326 average, 28 homers, and 120 ribbies. Led the league with 11 triples, also had 34 doubles, stole 21 bases in 22 attempts, led the league in OPS while putting up a 160 WRC plus and a 6.2 WAR on the season. He did miss some time with injury, played just 140 games for us. Certainly would love to have his bat back in the lineup if at all possible, but it is going to be a difficult decision. Nelson Ramiro, a youngster who spent time at first base and second base for us this year, had a really impressive rookie season when all was said and done. Batted .272 with 32 doubles, scored 78 runs, drove in 58 in 132 games played, ultimately put up a 113 WRC plus and a 2 WAR. Another guy who is a very versatile defensive player like Godina. Not quite the same bat as Godina, but depending on who we end up moving on from this coming offseason, Ramiro certainly would think to be on the team as a utility infielder and very well could be in the role for playing time as a starter, particularly against left-handed pitching next year. The other big decision in the infield on top of Godina is Chisen Iwata. Also been with us for 5 years. Hit over 300 this year. Led the league with 128 runs scored. Also had 48 stolen bases, the highest number of his career. The 140 WRC plus and the 6 WAR that Mr. Iwata put up this season were both career bests. So he is set to make a lot of money next season. He's typically been our shortstop over the last couple of seasons, although he did end up moving to second base at times in the playoffs against right-handed pitching. Looking at his fielding stats, he only played shortstop in the regular season, although, as I mentioned, we did pivot him to playing some second base in the postseason because in terms of his zone rating and his defensive efficiency, he was actually below average shortstop at both positions. Looking at him over the course of his career, he is a below average defensive shortstop, while he's well above average at second base. We do have some additional options in the middle infield for next year that we'll be talking about shortly. So, like Godina, Iwata's long-term future with us as this offseason begins is definitely in doubt. David Palomares, the left-handed hitting middle infielder, played second base for most of the year for us against right-handed pitching, which let us pivot Iwata to shortstop. And he had a respectable season this year, .254 average, did hit 16 home runs, drove in 65, stole 10 bases, ultimately put up a 107 OPS plus, a 102 WRC plus, and a 2.1 WAR. A respectable offensive player with a solid, versatile glove, signed to a contract that's not going to be paying him a ton of money, even if he ends up only being a middle infielder for us. I think Palomares' contract is one that we can handle. One that will likely be moving on from is utility infielder Phil Swenson, set to make about $3 million next year, and he's out of arbitration eligibility. Only had 74 at-bats for us this year while starting 13 games. Was close to a league average offensive player, but at the price tag he's looking for next year, moving on from Swenson could be a way for us to save a little more money. The first player we're going to talk about who will definitely be back with us and definitely be back with us exactly where he's played most of his entire career is third baseman Juan Pimentel. Once again, led the league in at-bats and hits. Overall hit .317 with 31 homers, 126 ribbies. Also stole 31 bases, so he's a member of the 30-30 club for a second consecutive season. Put up an overall 6.4 WAR a year after leading the league and winning his second most valuable player award. Pimentel is starting to get a little more expensive, going to be making $10 million next year, but the contract we proactively signed him to before he was an established major leaguer has certainly worked out in our favor. Infielder Luis Rangel is a guy we didn't really think we'd be moving on from a year ago, but very possible at this time. Spent most of the year in AAA Las Vegas, only 34 at-bats at the major league level. Was an above-average offensive player, all things considered, despite that .235 average with a couple of doubles, a homer, 8 ribbies, and a stolen base in his limited playing time. Unfortunately, Rangel is in his last option year, so he won't be able to be optioned to the minors next season. Is still set to make the major league minimum, but his offensive ratings have really deteriorated over this past year. Looking at our scouting reports, and you can see his contact is as low as it's ever been. He's lost a lot of potential power, and his eye is definitely weakened as well. Don't know exactly whether it's just our scout is off, but if you look at his lack of offensive production this year with the batting average just .235 in the majors and the ratings that we see, he's a much less interesting player than he used to be. Certainly, depending on what happens, could be competing for a utility infield spot with us, but that's probably the most prominent role we'd expect him to have heading into next season. And part of the reason that we can think about moving on from the likes of Rangel and Swenson is that Juan Moreno is on the way. The 22-year-old only played with us in the playoffs in the majors, but had an excellent year between AA and AAA in the minors. Outstanding speed and outstanding defensively. Definitely envision Moreno taking over for us as our starting shortstop next year, even if we do bring back Iwata. Looking at the playoffs and what happened, only 2 for 17, making his major league debut in the World Series and the ALCS and the ALDS with us. Actually, I think it was only the ALCS in the World Series. I believe we put him onto the roster when Godina got hurt. Actually, so he was in all 3 series because Godina got hurt in the divisional series, and that's when we put Moreno onto the team. So 2 for 17, certainly not a rousing start for his career, particularly with 7 strikeouts. But you look at what he did offensively this season in the minors, and you look at his ratings, and there's really not a lot left for him to prove there. Like the left-handed hitting middle infielder, ranked as the number 26 prospect in baseball, and think at the very least he will be a nice upgrade for us defensively at shortstop next season. Similar to our situation in the infield, we could have some material turnover in the outfield this offseason as well. Juan Ramirez has spent the last 3 years primarily as a DH. We used him more in the outfield this year. A less productive offensive season for him than his first 2 years. His 25 homers and his 95 ribbies were both career lows, but he did have a career-high 39 doubles, 273 average, tied last season as the best in his career. Ultimately, though, a 109 WRC plus and only half a win above replacement. He's pretty much been brutal every position that we've tried him at. Zone rating and defensive efficiency in left field, where he played most frequently, well below average. Didn't actually make any errors on the year, but I think we need to think about Big Thunder as a primary designated hitter if we do end up bringing him back next season. Darnell Selvey, similar to both Luis Godina and Chisin Iwata, is an established, excellent veteran who may just make too much money for us to bring back next year, but had a really nice bounce-back season. 29 doubles or 29 homers and 112 ribbies this year, both materially higher than in 2043 when he had some injuries. Also stole 23 bases for us, ultimately put up a 132 WRC plus and a 4.5 WAR on the season. Still a very competent defensive left fielder with some pop in his bat. The question, as with Godina and Iwata, is whether we can justify paying over $20 million for Selvey next year, given some of the other options on our roster. Center fielder Luis Aguilar has been a utility outfielder for us the past several years. Hit just a $194 in 108 at bats this year. Does still have 2 option years left, but set to make close to $2.5 million next year. Given that at best he's going to be a 5th outfielder for us, we'll probably look to see if we can get anything in return for trade for Aguilar in the coming weeks. As I noted earlier, could be a similar situation with Bobby Armstrong. When we look at his batting ratings, we think that Armstrong should be a above average offensive player. Unfortunately, most times in his career he has not been. Put up just an 82 WRC plus for us this past year, 220 average and only 5 home runs in 273 at-bats. Was basically a replacement level player when all was said and done. So a year after putting up a 4 WAR and us thinking, hey, maybe we really have solved the center field issue, it is once again a question as we head into the offseason. But it may not be a question for long with the way young Ben Prince played during the playoffs. He ended up being named the MVP of the divisional series. Spent most of the year in AA and AAA. But we did bring him up in September, where he started 9 games for us, primarily against left-handed pitching. Hit 290 with a 127 WRC plus. And then as we got into the postseason, he was even better. Hit over 400 for us while starting 14 postseason games. So he was our starter in center field for every game of the run to the World Series. Ended up with 5 doubles, a triple, and a couple of homers, a 223 WRC plus. And the development of Prince does mean that it's almost certain that Aguilar or Armstrong will be gone next year. And it's possible they both will be. Guy coming off of a bit of an off year for him that we probably won't move on from is Arturo Uresti. Perennial Gold Glove winner in right field, who also has a really bat. And although the batting average dipped to 221 this year, he still had over 30 home runs, still drove in 90, still stole almost 30 bases, was 1 stolen base away from a second consecutive 30-30 year. Draws a lot of walks, so his on-base percentage was well over 100 points better than his batting average, and when all was said and done, put up a 110 WRC plus and a 4.1 WAR for us. Uresti set to make $12 million next year, but in the context of guys like Selvey, Iwata, and Godina looking to likely be making about twice as much as that, I think the certainty that we have in Uresti is something that we'll likely bring back. He is a IAFA signing from 14 years ago who has become a very productive player for us. The 31-year-old has 255 home runs in his career. He's hit 30-plus home runs for us in 5 of the last 6 seasons at this point. Regularly is among the league leaders in walks and has a 124 career WRC plus, although as we talked about was below that this past season. So in both the outfield and the infield, we're definitely going to have some big decisions to make. I think between Selvey, Iwata, and Godina, we definitely will have to move on from one of those players. The question is whether we'll need to end up moving on from 2 of them. And if we do end up to need to move on from 2 of those 3 players, we'll be thinking long and hard about who makes the most sense to bring back, given the other strengths and weaknesses of our squad. Turning to our review of our outstanding pitching staff, we'll start with a couple of options that aren't on the roster right now. Mike Blumenshine suffered that sprained ankle on the last day of the regular season, and unfortunately our number 4 starter missed the entire playoffs. 8-6 record with a 3.85 ERA and a 2.7 WAR this year. Hopefully he will be healthy and well for next season. John Knight, another guy who started some games for us this year, only 3. Had a rough season with an ERA of over 5, was below replacement level. Went out for the season in mid-August with shoulder inflammation, and still going to be a couple months before he's healthy. Knight at this point set to make $1.6 million in arbitration next year. So even though he's coming off of an injury, given that he is a guy who can start for us if we need him to, would likely think that he will be back with us next year. One arbitration-eligible player that we'll definitely be looking to bring back is Federico Arriola. The 3-time defending Cy Young Award winner has led the AL in wins for 4 straight years. 18-7 this year. That's the fewest wins he's had while leading the league in wins. Led the league in innings pitched and put up a 4.6 WAR for us this year, although his ERA did climb to 3.79. Set to make about $15.5 million next year, but given how outstanding he is and that he's been a guy who's consistently gone on the mound every 5 days for us over the course of his career, would expect that Arriola will be back as our number 1 starter next year. Luis Villarreal, the young lefty, 14-9 with a 3.59 ERA in his second year in the majors. 121 ERA plus, 81 FIP minus. He's a guy who we signed to a extension before he had much major league experience, and still making relatively little money right now, although in theory he's making more than he would if he was still making the major league minimum. Kevin King, who we traded for from Arizona this past offseason, like Arriola, arbitration eligible. The number is going to likely be a little less than $7 million. We would expect we'll bring him back as our number 3 starter. 14-4 record this year with a league best 202 strikeouts, 3.38 ERA, and a 3.4 WAR for our A's. So feel real good about the rotation next year with Arriola, Villarreal, and King in the top 3 spots. As we talked about, guys like Blumenshine and Knight could also be in the mix. And 2 others who could once again be in the mix are the lefty Macho Rangel, who pitched just 12 games this year. Some pretty significant injuries for him. 4.60 ERA and a 0.4 WAR in what was definitely a down season for the 25-year-old. Ernesto Camuñez had a really nice season for us. 14-4 with a 3.86 ERA, typically as our number 5 starter, a year after pitching in just 6 games for us because of injuries. Did put up a 2 WAR. We only had him start 1 game in the playoffs, replacing Blumenshine as our 4th starter in the divisional series. We ended up using Rangel as our 4th starter in both the ALCS and the World Series. Neither was particularly effective in those starting roles, so hopefully the return of Blumenshine and or Knight will ultimately mean that only one of those guys will likely be in the rotation next year, but still feel like we've got a lot of options. Joe Heilman, simply the best reliever in baseball, 39 saves this year, pitched in just 59 games since we were blowing people out pretty frequently. Ultimately had a 1.36 earned run average and struck out almost 15 batters per 9 innings, put up a WAR of over 3 for the 2nd consecutive season for us. He's going to be making a lot of money next year, looking to make around $9 million, but he has been so dominant as a closer for us, hitting the triple digits on the radar gun, and over the course of his major league career at this point, putting up a brilliant 177 ERA plus and a 61 FIP minus, with career bests in both of those numbers this past season. Likely willing to bring him back on that number, perhaps depending on how next season goes. Could move him into more of a stopper role to get him a few more innings pitched. Lefty Wilson Rangel, as I mentioned, is a guy we may have to move on from, which is unfortunate because he's become an excellent reliever for us. Led the league in holds 2 consecutive years. put up a 2.76 ERA over 91 and a third innings out of the bullpen this year. But Rangel set to be making almost $5 million next year, although he's been really good for us over the course of his major league career. 132 ERA plus and a 67 FIP minus. Just don't know that we'll be able to justify paying that kind of money to him. Jonathan Shearer, who we went through the same decision with last offseason and ultimately moved on from, although we traded for him as a rental this past season. Similar situation, 3.67 ERA for us over 41 and 2/3 innings. But Shearer is a free agent looking for $16 million a year over 4 years. So as good as he is, he will not be back. Righty reliever David Ibarra has a very interesting profile. Unfortunately, after a really great start to his career, he had an awful season. 5.84 earned run average and almost as many meltdowns as shutdowns this season. That said, I think he did get a bit unlucky, as his 346 BABIP would indicate. Still was a win above replacement level with a Sierra that was almost 3 runs better than his actual ERA. So our thought is that Ibarra probably got unlucky this year and would expect him to be back in a bullpen role for us next season. Have similar hopes for Roque de la Paz, a very injury-plagued year for the 22-year-old this year. Pitched just 9 games between AAA and the majors. But if the lefty De La Paz is able to stay healthy next year, that will make us feel better about potentially moving on from the lefty reliever, Wilson Rangel, for financial reasons. Righty reliever Jesus Berlanga, set to be back next season, making the major league minimum, put up a sub-4 ERA with almost 12 strikeouts per 9 innings this year, although technically he was just below replacement level, but still making the major league minimum. Would expect him back. Interesting decision on Bobby Surgener. He is now arbitration eligible, although the arbitration number is not going to be that high. 3.74 ERA over 55 and a third innings. Definitely at his peak is not as good as Wilson Rangel, but he's also going to cost about 25% of what Rangel will cost next year, which I think among the arbitration-eligible lefty relievers means we're more likely to bring Surgener back. A big part of the reason that we may end up moving on from the lefty Rangel on top of De La Paz and Surgener is that there's 3 other guys in the mix. 21-year-old Mike Mercer, we moved all the way from high A ball to the majors this year. He put up an ugly 7.27 ERA in 8 2/3 innings pitched, but did strike out 14 batters in that limited playing time, and certainly would think he will be competing for a lefty spot in the bullpen next year, particularly if we move on from Rangel. Savion Keys, a 1.80 ERA over 40 innings pitched, spent the entire season with us. Our pitching was just so good that didn't get a ton of action, but when we did give an opportunity to him, he was effective. Another guy who's making the major league minimum, and along with De La Paz, Surgener, and Mercer, another reason why we may move on from Rangel for financial reasons. Final lefty, Ronnie Dean. This is a guy who really struggled this year at the major league level, an ERA of close to 8 in only 13 2/3 innings. So a small sample size, but definitely was not good with a whip of close to 2. But a year ago, in a small sample size in the majors, he was pretty effective, and he did do a good job for us in AAA. Another guy who will be competing for a roster spot next year. Jerry Stevenson, 10-5 for us with a 4.50 ERA as a starter in AAA. Did end up pitching 10 games for us in the majors this year, including a start in game 162. Put up a 3.65 ERA over 24 2/3 innings, but he did walk 15 batters. I think his control is always going to be an issue. View him as a cheap option to be a long reliever and or a 5th starter if we have massive injury issues, but don't necessarily think that Stevenson is a huge part of our long-term future. But in contrast to our offensive and everyday players, where we're expecting a lot of turnover among both infielders and outfielders, this screen that you're looking at right here with 16 different pitchers on it, I would expect at least 12 of these guys and possibly 13 of them to be on our major league roster when next season starts. Got a lot of depth in the rotation, and as I mentioned, there's actually 2 other guys who are on the IL who will be in the mix as well. So that actually puts it up to 18 players fighting for 13 spots. Would expect Stevenson is probably most likely among the group to start the season in the minors. Can probably say the same thing about Ronnie Dehan. But even if we move on from Rangel with Villarreal and Macho Rangel in the rotation, and De La Paz, Surgener, Mercer, Keys, and maybe Dehan fighting for lefty spots in the bullpen. Wilson Rangel, either in the trade market, hopefully, or in a worst-case scenario, just deciding not to make an arbitration offer to him, is a guy who, despite his quality, may have pitched his final game in an Oakland Athletics uniform. And before we finish things up, and as we start strategizing about what we might want to do this offseason, we'll just shop a few of the guys that we may need to be moving on from, starting with Luis Godina, expecting that there's going to be a very strong demand for him, even though he's going to be making a lot of money next year. And you can see there are tons of options, many of whom are excellent players that we could pick up if we decided to move on from Luis Godina. 25-year-old shortstop Mike Box, solid offensive player, solid defensively, still going to be making the major league minimum next year. Guy who's actually claimed on waivers from Baltimore has become a 2-time All-Star already. Jonathan Comer, 25-year-old starting pitcher. Love that durability there from the Dodgers organization. Was 15-8 with a 3.33 ERA this past year. Don't need much help in the rotation, but certainly if we were able to pick up a guy like Warlock Comer, maybe we trade away some of the more fragile pitchers in our rotation for some other help and build a better roster that way. Nelson Ramirez, another starting pitcher, guy who's making a lot more money, set to be making close to $25 million in arbitration next year, so certainly wouldn't help us as far as getting money off of the books. But as you can see, there is a very impressive list of players that we can trade Mr. Godina for. I'm thinking, in my view, he's probably the most valuable of the 3 guys set to be making tons of money next year that we're going to have to be considering moving on from. But I would expect that the demand for Darnell Selvey and Chisen Iwata is not much less. Looking at Selvey, another pretty impressive list of players, some familiar names. Ken Yohannes, Mike Box were both on the list of people that we could get for Godina. So there is going to be demand for all of these guys. It's just a matter of which direction we would choose to go. I guess I'm assuming there's demand that's pretty significant for all of these guys. I don't know why it would be any different for Chisen Iwata. And you can see a ton of different paths to potentially follow with him as well. Jonathan Comer, the starting pitcher, is on that list. Jimmy Bekowski, another pitcher who we have looked at from the Dodgers organization as a potential trade target in the past. Fragile physically, but still an outstanding pitcher when he's healthy. Honestly, it looks like the demand for Iwata could be pretty close to what we saw from Godina. So definitely a ton of options for us to think about. We'll look at 2 more options. Bobby Armstrong, we've talked about. He may just be out of time in Oakland with the emergence of Mr. Prince. And given that Armstrong is set to make $6 million next year, not going to be a huge impact on our overall salary situation. But moving on from a guy like Armstrong, along with a few other guys, might put us in a position where we can bring 2 out of 3 back, thinking about Selvey, Godina, and Iwata instead of maybe only one of them. Going to get a much different number here for what we can get for Armstrong. But there's actually some people still interested in him. We've talked a lot about the past few seasons that Armstrong on paper looks better than the way that he really produces. But there's definitely some value here. Not going to get a superstar back in return, but there are definitely options to get that contract off the books if we decide that's what makes sense. And last but not least, we've talked a lot recently about Wilson Rangel, and although he's an excellent reliever for us, the money that he's looking for next year probably just doesn't work. Can get close to $5 million off the books if we decided to move on from Mr. Rangel. And you can see that the demand for him is actually pretty solid. Not quite what we got for the big three, but a lot more interesting options to consider for Mr. Rangel than even what we saw for Bobby Armstrong. So we are going to have options in the trade market to get some salary on the books while bringing back guys who can help at the major league level. And we're certainly also going to, over time, explore some of the options for prospects as well, because given that we don't have a huge need on the pitching side right now, and we do have some pretty solid minor leaguers who could fill in for some of the infielders and outfielders that we might be moving on from this season, bringing even younger talent into the organization if we need to trade 1 or 2 of these guys away is another option that we're going to seriously consider. And with that, we will call it an episode. Next time around, we will take a look at our farm system. You got a preview right here. We got 3 of the top 15 prospects in baseball in our organization. So once again, the farm system for our Oakland Athletics is very strong. We'll also take a look back at some of the prospects who are more prominent in the league that we didn't draft in previous years, oftentimes against the advice of the Worldwide Scouting Department, and check in on a bunch of our former players as well. So we are going to continue thinking about what we might need to do this offseason before we get it underway. If you have any thoughts based on our discussion of our roster, how everyone performed last season, and some of the potential opportunities available in the trade market, would love to hear them in the comments down below if you'd like to contribute as a member of the Worldwide Scouting Department. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.